Hello, I'm Dan Costa, the editor-in-chief of Techonomy and Worth magazine, and welcome to another edition of Worth Knowing, where I have the privilege of talking to some leaders in tech, business, and public policy who are changing the way we live, work, and play today. I'm joined today by Natasha Vendangos. Natasha is the Associate Vice President for Innovation and Technology Policy at the Environmental Defense Fund, also known as EDF. She has a PhD in biophysics and chemistry and is currently working on how to use policy analysis and creative partnerships to drive climate innovation. Natasha, thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
I should add, EDF is also a key sponsor helping us hold the Techonomy Climate NYC conference. That's going to happen on September 20th during Climate Week right here in New York City. We still have tickets available. We'll post a link to those tickets in the chat and in the show notes. And you can hear more about these types of topics there if you happen to be in town. Let's just set the stage for people because this may air, people might be listening to this at some point in the future. But right now, as we speak, the tropical island of Maui is still smoldering. The desert city of Los Angeles is recovering from a hurricane. And the Canadian Arctic has been burning for months on end. All these things are happening. How is, you're based in Washington, D.C., focused on policy. How is the conversation about how to respond to climate change changed because of these circumstances, or has?
I'd say on one hand, it hasn't changed, and the other hand, it changes everything. Starting with the what hasn't changed, all of these tragedies that we're seeing are perfectly on point with what we expect to happen. We know from the science that we are going to see more manifestations of the climate emergency, and that is nothing new, and more is coming, and we're seeing it now. But it's not a surprise. And those of us who are working in front of the scenes or behind the scenes to try to address the climate crisis are very much focused on the how. What can we do to make sure we change the dynamics so that these emergencies stop, so that we can reverse and really get to a stable climate? But I would also say what we're able to do is very much shaped by the world of politics, and politics responds quickly when there's a greater understanding that there's a human impact. So seeing the photos of the beaches, hearing about the lives lost, thinking about the nature that many of us have seen and witnessed and love, and feeling the eyes burn from the wildfire smoke. Once it becomes more personal and it feels like more of a threat to our personal lives, it makes it that much more of a priority, and that can open the door for more people to join and to work towards seeing progress in the climate movement. So that at the end of the day could be everything.
So in your bio, and as I just mentioned, you talk about using policy, analysis, and creative partnerships as sort of the three strategic approaches to making change. I want to dig a little bit into each of those. When it comes to policy, clearly, like the biggest policy change that's happened in the last couple of years is the passage of the IRA. How has that affected this conversation?
Massively. We're hearing talk of a tidal wave of investments and a game change in the before IRA and the after IRA. It hasn't solved the problem for us. We're not done. But it's very difficult to think of what the last couple of years would have been without the IRA. And I would venture to guess that in 10 years, we're not going to be able to imagine what the economy would have been without the IRA. I'd also throw in there the bipartisan infrastructure law, which also has enormous impacts. And one could say also the CHIPS and Science Act, which has specific elements that are very, very relevant for the innovation space. So I would just say that at the end of the day, innovation is really about a system. If there's one thing you take away from me, this is my favorite song. Innovation is about the system. So it's not just about thinking about a specific technological solution to a specific technological problem. It's really about how we solve the overarching problems in our world. And that means that innovation can apply to better policy, better regulatory frameworks, a better communication with communities on the ground, greater understanding of why we're pursuing what we're pursuing. And yes, I do think technology is a critical part of that story, and how we deploy it is a critical part of how we move forward. So policy really is the major mechanism for society to signal where we need to go. And it's complicated, it's messy, it's likened often to sausage making. Sometimes you need major compromises, which can lead to strange bedfellows and strange solutions. But at the end of the day, it's really a way for society to signal what we want the world to look like and how we should move it forward, and give greater assurance to the private sector that we know what we're building toward.
So one of the things in the IRA, which had shades, it's one of its predecessors was the Green New Deal, which was basically a wish list of everything that the left wanted in terms of policy. And it started to get bogged down because in terms of the prescriptions, it was like, oh, we're going to build more electric charging stations. And then the conversation moved to, well, where should they be? How many should they be? What are the standards for them? And it seems to me that's where a lot of policy goes to die, is when those details need to be hammered out. The IRA pushed through, a lot of that money is allocated. Like, can you give some examples like that people would appreciate of like how that money is going to get spent and how it's going to make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, the IRA is actually a very diverse package. It has, production incentives for fuels like hydrogen, for electric vehicles, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, for renewable energy development, for home retrofits. It has incentives for educational programs and rural development programs to try to reach more folks across the country. It also has a program like a federal Buy Clean program that uses the power of the federal purse to try to create a demand for materials like cleaner cement and cleaner steel. So it's as much as it was a complicated affair to bring together all the different parts of it, and as much as it's not a perfectly hermetically sealed package, it really hit a lot of bases, a really remarkable number of bases to try to move forward across every sector, including sectors that are often left behind a bit, like agriculture and heavy industry, but also seeing major shifts in the space of transportation and power.
So one of the other strategic initiatives, you talk about using analysis to affect change. And it seems to me the environmental movement has been awash in analysis for many years. The facts and figures have been being put out there, and people just weren't paying attention to them. So how do you sort of deploy analysis, and where do you see the opportunities to use analysis to make change?
I would say there is an expression in DC that we can fall into analysis paralysis. I've seen it. I'm familiar with it. It's a very fair criticism, and one that we should be keeping close in mind. At the end of the day, analysis has the major function of moving us in the direction of action and making sure we're moving in the right direction. So there are different kinds of it. Sometimes you need analysis to know what the right answer is. There are immense complexities. If you take the example of a Buy Clean program, there are immense complexities to how you set that up, how you define green steel, how you determine how the federal government would pay it forward. There are lessons that have to be learned from the level of how you actually define what is clean and how the government would actually administer such a program. And different kinds of information are flowing right now to try to understand, how do we solve this? And there are different strategies. Really intelligent, brilliant people can disagree about which strategy is best. And the analysis very often is a question of doing your homework to figure out how you can learn what the best options are and what we should really be taking a run at. There's also analysis for just making the case. Should we care about climate? Is it a problem? Is something else a bigger problem than climate? Are we gonna harm ourselves by doing something to try to address the climate crisis? And in those cases, it's really a question of teeing up and understanding and educating and also learning from the concerns and the considerations that other people are thinking about. So that's analysis too. But at the end of the day, I would agree with you that all of our analysis should really be moving us in the direction of productive action, and not be something that sits on a shelf just for interesting discussions.
Yeah. And I should probably confess too that, I think one of the criticisms of the media coverage of the climate crisis is that, a lot of the examples we use are anecdotal. And I started this interview with 3 anecdotes about what could arguably be called weather that may not, they may be outliers. And I think that I think that's a fair criticism, that we have to look at those examples and not just assume that they should all be tied together and having some kind of root cause. But it does make for better storytelling. So, the paralysis analysis may be Washington, D.C.'s problem, but, misinterpreting anecdotes may be a media problem that we have to address.
I do think there's a sweet spot in the middle. where, those who are deep into the weeds of specific, quantitative solutions and what we understand and what we don't understand, could really be leaning in harder on understanding how we're telling the story and what this means. This is something that originally, attracted me over to the policy space from the science world, thinking about this universe of scientists speaking to each other. How do we really make sure that it's really speaking to the world as well? So I know that both sides can come to the middle to a place where we're both being enlightened, fact-based, using the best kind of analysis that we can, but also telling that story, because that really is what moves the ball in DC.
So you talk about creative partnerships, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but to me, when I hear the word creative partnership, it means partnering with someone who may not be a natural partner and whose interests may not have historically aligned with your own. And to me, the immediate example would be fossil fuel companies who've spent a lot of time pushing against or arguing against climate change. Is that the kind of creative partnership that you're talking about there?
That would be one example, but I would say that, partnerships can, just like analysis, partnerships can take on different forms, different functions. You can come together to make a political statement and use the many different kinds of voices at the table to make that statement for the purpose of moving the needle in politics. But you can also demonstrate progress. We love the leadership coming out of the private sector that says, you know what, we're going to take a stand and see what we can do about climate. That leadership really can be transformational and is incredibly meaningful. So, EDF recently has a collaboration with Danone in which, it's looking to reduce methane emissions across the dairy pipeline. That is massively important work to move forward. But to your question about, areas like oil and gas companies, I would just say that this crisis is too urgent to ignore anyone in a position to help. A few things can be true at the same time. One is that oil and gas companies have tremendous resources and can be immensely innovative. They're in a position to potentially invest in reducing climate pollution and investing in clean energy. And if they take that obligation seriously, they can be a major part of the solution. But I'll also say that, some of them are taking that obligation seriously and some of them are not. We'll judge not by words, but by their actions. We'd like them to stay engaged and we'd like them to do better, and we'll push them and judge them based on what they do. And I think this is the place where really the policy can have an immense impact, because at the end of the day, are we monitoring, reporting, and verifying? Do we understand what the final impacts are of the solutions that we're pursuing? Follow the money, see where they're going next. And yes, sometimes oil and gas companies will stand on a stage and say that they want to just preserve the life of the oil industry for the coming century. We know we can't do it in terms of the climate reality. But if we are seeing a serious move towards newer strategies and a transformation of the oil industry that converts them to a major part of the future clean energy, clean climate economy, that's something that we should recognize and can move forward on.
I think there's also a lot of partnerships in just mainstream businesses that never really thought that that are thinking about their climate impact now in a way they wouldn't have 5 years ago, or certainly 10 years ago. That may not be, high. They may not be fossil fuel companies, but they still have an emissions footprint, and now they're starting to keep track of it and understand the consequences of their business decisions. And there's a lot of efficiencies that they can create that could also be good for the environment. I don't know if you know of any examples there that you could refer to, but it seems like it's on the average business's radar in a way it just never has been before.
I do think we're moving to a moment in time, and this has been stimulated a bit by Bill and Ira as well, but it was already on its way, where young people in particular are aware of the climate crisis, want to incorporate aspects of making a difference in terms of climate change into their careers. And there's also an awareness that almost every industry, every activity has a link to climate change. Are we talking about real estate insurance? Are we talking about school teachers? Are we talking about unions and construction workers? Everybody has a potential role that they can play in moving us towards a future that is climate friendly and that preserves a more stable future for our kids. And so, now is really the time where I think we need every aspect. We need people to be thinking about climate, whether you work at a utility or whether you work at the local library. And there's really a real role to be played across the board.
So one of the solutions that I know EDF has explored a lot, and a lot of industries have, is this idea of carbon capture and storage technologies. The idea that we have pumped out all this carbon, but there are tools and techniques and innovations that we can use to take that carbon back out of the atmosphere. It was super, super popular that everybody thought this was going to be the thing, the silver bullet. I think we know it's probably not a silver bullet, but what's your take on how effective those strategies can be?
It's a great question. So whenever I talk about carbon dioxide removal, I like to start with the fact that the first thing we need to do is mitigation. There's the cliche that if you want to get out of a hole, the first thing to do is to stop digging. So yeah, stop digging. Make sure that we prioritize that first and foremost. But if you take the next step and look at what comes next, it's also true that there's not a single piece of analysis done by the deep thinkers that finds that we can get to our Paris climate goals all the way based on solar and wind and the obvious solutions that are already commercialized in the market. There's just a nasty little slice that we don't necessarily have the full solutions to get to. And very often people point to that slice and say, we're going to need some carbon management. And you look at also just the difficulty in the politics of making the choices that leads us to climate action. And we're behind. How many years has the IPCC told us, we made these commitments and actually we're behind on those commitments? In the United States, Bill and Ira was the first time we really took a leap forward towards those commitments. But even so, with Bill and Ira, current estimates are that it'll get us most of the way there, but not all the way there. We're still running about 5 years behind. So this is also a very real reality. One thing I will flag is that carbon management means a lot of very, very different things. And I go back to my favorite song, that innovation is about the system. So the context of those various versions of carbon management are extremely different. And as a result, the way we talk about it needs to be different too. There are examples of point source carbon capture and storage. There are examples of engineered solutions that take carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere, like direct air capture. And then there's a whole host of nature-based solutions that have immense scale and potentially come with biodiversity benefits as well, like preserving forest land and ensuring richness of carbon in soils, ocean strategies. But all of these have their own potential upsides and downsides. As you alluded to, there's no technology or strategy that would be deployed at scale that is a simple silver bullet and will just be easy. We have to approach it like an engineer and think about how we make it work and what it would take to make these different solutions work. So, there are a lot of different things we have to keep in mind. We have to make sure we're not doing harm unintentionally. We have to make sure that if we're putting CCS onto a plant, we're not harming local communities with additional pollution. We're not extending the life of polluting fossil fuels and allowing a greenwashing opportunity. That is just not an acceptable way to go. But we also know that there can be unexpected benefits as well, like carbon dioxide that comes from direct air capture could potentially become the next feedstock for clean aviation fuels. So you may find that there are new strategies where these different kinds of technological solutions can integrate and create something new that's greater than the sum of its parts. We're still figuring out all of those pieces, and they're fast evolving, and it's rather new that they're all communicating with one another the way they are. And then you think about some of the nature-based solutions, and they can range everywhere from something that is incredibly reasonable, good, solid conservation practices that we absolutely should be pursuing to the fullest extent.
I hear you talking about planting trees.
Yeah, planting trees, but it can also verge into the space that's practically geoengineering. So, one sentence that says nature-based climate solutions can mean an awful lot of very different things. But there's one uniform thing that we get down to for all of them, which is how do we monitor, verify, report, and understand what the real impacts are? And there's a lot of work ahead to make sure we do that in a way that really brings the climate movement together so that we have something closer to a universal understanding of what we're trying to incentivize, and we can move more clearly towards it. That will have the impact of basically making our climate future come into focus from a space where currently it's still got some very, very blurry bits.
So what are types of innovations or innovative systems have you seen that you're particularly excited about, that you think, this is a solution that could scale? I see how this could be profitable for businesses, and I see the policy connection, the policy infrastructure to support it. Is there anything that you're like, I think this is a system that could make a difference?
Yeah, I mean there are a lot of different systems opportunities. I feel like this is both the major blessing and the curse of this current moment in time that, there was a time when the power system and the transportation system seemed to be totally separate things, different stakeholders, they didn't have talk confabs, they didn't call each other. And now all of a sudden we're talking about virtual power plants and the potential for vehicle to grid technologies and electrification of buildings and electrification of vehicles can suddenly create all of these interesting dynamics for grid stability and resilience and reliability. These are new things. And as a result, you're seeing all of these interesting combinations between the potential for electrifying industry, having power impacts, having transportation impacts. The Department of Energy has a program on hydrogen and direct air capture hubs, which is stimulating a new level of conversation around how would you actually pull multiple of these pieces together? Can you solve multiple problems at once? Can we use less infrastructure and use it better and use it more efficiently? It's also raising a number of different challenges and questions that we haven't solved definitively in the past. How do you work closely with communities that are nearby to make sure that they really have a seat at the table when these things are being developed? How do you think about the most efficient use of and the most efficient ways of decarbonizing industry and some of these other areas that have been considered hard to decarbonize in the past? We're at the point now where we just need to decarbonize and none of this hard business. We got to just get it done. But there's a lot to be learned right at this moment in time. And there's a lot that's going to change based on what we learn in the coming few years. But the scale of the market for these interstitial opportunities that exist as a combination of multiple sectors are likely to really blossom going forward, thanks to the bill and IRA.
So if there was like one fact that you think our audience should know that was really worth knowing, what do you think it should be?
At the risk of being very repetitive, I'll go back and actually steal a quote from EDF's chief scientist, in which he says, you can really make anything look good if you set really narrow boundary conditions. You want to save the world with one specific technology, just, look at the specific boundary conditions. You can make it solve one problem and you're done. The real challenge that lies ahead for us is that we need to set the full boundary conditions, basically much, much larger than we've done before. But that also unlocks all different kinds of innovation that can exist in between the sectors, in between the technologies, and how they all work together. And I am immensely optimistic and immensely excited about where we take those opportunities next.
I think it's a great quote and a great point, and I think it also goes to the fact that the problem with our boundaries is that we are used to thinking in terms of nation state boundaries, and this is a problem that goes far beyond those and really can't be solved by any one nation. Although you certainly argue that the industrialized nations should bear a heavier burden, but are you still optimistic that given the global scale of the challenges that whatever the United States does, that we can bring China and Europe along with us, and then all of the developing nations as well?
It's a very good question and one that I respect deeply. I wouldn't want to give a glib answer to that because there are major, major interests at play. This is the intersection of international diplomacy and security, energy security, climate security, national security. But I will say this, that, we have seen in the past how working towards the climate impact can really work. We're already seeing in Europe a certain kind of mirroring of the ambition in the US Inflation Reduction Act to try to make sure that they're capturing and that they're sort of raising to the bar. So there is an aspect where we can really have a race to the top and making sure that we get where we need to go. But I will say we have our work cut out for us to make sure that we hold ourselves accountable, that we achieve greater transparency, and we really understand where different countries are being productive in the conversation. But there's a lot for us to do here at home. There's a lot for us to do together with our allies, and we certainly urge all others to take their part in saving this precious, precious planet of ours.
So obviously we have goals for 2030, which we could debate whether we're on track for them or not. In some ways we're ahead of schedule, in some ways we're behind schedule. Let's take it a couple years past that to 2033, 10 years from now. The deadline is passed. What is the innovation in clean energy landscape look like to your eye?
My eye will look very, very different. One of my other favorite quotes that gets batted around in the DC area is that people have a tendency to overestimate what we can do in a year and underestimate what we can do in 10. Sustained effort over a decade can really move mountains. And already with Bill and Ira, we're seeing a pretty impressive burst of activity. And we're talking about, pretty much $500 billion of investment going forward. This is an immensely scalable market. The market signals are still catching up to make sure that we're driving in the direction that we need to go. But again, as we continue to see climate impacts, as it starts to become more pervasive in our daily lives, as it starts to impact us more personally, this is not going to become less important going forward. It's going to become more important. So I think that we're going to see a really extraordinary step forward. There's going to be dedicated and growing industries serving clean energy and climate-friendly economy. There are going to be more players with more political clout, more people eager to defend and expand the potential of those jobs, more educational programs that are really serving that pipeline. We're already seeing the beginning of this. It's already happening. It's going to really scale. I think also we're going to see that a greater awareness that just fixing one little thing or one technological solution can't move fast and break things, especially when it comes to people's lives and environmental impacts. Nobody likes to feel like a guinea pig. Nobody likes to feel like what we're doing is an experimentation. So we're living in this moment in time with a sort of a challenge that we have to move fast and we have to do new things, but we have to make sure that we're really protecting people along the way and involving them so that this is something that we're doing together. That's not the real status quo, modus operandi of how we've done infrastructure development in the past, and we need to get a lot better at it. So, I am optimistic that we will really learn some critical lessons to make this more of something we're moving forward as a society. I also think, coming back to a topic that does not sound flashy, but is the heart and the soul of the whole thing, I think there's going to be a greater emphasis on transparency. I think that we're going to get to a place where, as we are able to monitor, verify, and understand the real impacts of what we're doing, make it more performance-based, make it more about measurements and rapid understanding of what we're doing and what happened and how we move next, we're going to be able to learn a whole lot more quickly. We're going to be more agile. It's going to get easier to do all of that monitoring, verifying, and reporting. And that's going to enable us to really make sure that we're designing policies and the market framework such that we're delivering what we need to deliver. So that's an area where we still have a lot of work to do, but once we cross that threshold of doing better, it will make all of our efforts a whole lot more additive.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think, I know the term ESG is sort of fallen out of fashion, and I think that's probably fine. But nobody ever really talked about the G enough in terms of the accounting, the accountability, and just, the governance and the transparency, as you point out, which is, a huge step forward and something that's very, very necessary to make progress here. Great. So I just have to say, and you can take this, but our next conversation, I've already decided the title of it's going to be Bill and Ira's Great Adventure. Or Excellent Adventure. Bill and Ira's Excellent Adventure. We've got to make that happen.
100%. We've got to make that happen. I agree. You can't let that one pass by.
No, we're not going to waste it. We're not going to waste it. Natasha, thanks so much for taking time out of your day to talk to us. I really appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. And that'll be the latest edition of Worth Knowing. Tune in next week. We will have all new programming. Thanks so much for joining us.